and welcome to the Human 2 podcast, the podcast that investigates how we stay human and true to ourselves during challenging times in our professional lives, with a focus on the accountancy and finance profession. After all, accountancy human too. I'm Hannah, I'm the founder of Accountancy Hub and director of Human 2 Limited. I'm also an inclusion consultant and an ICAW chartered accountant. Today, I talk to Jim Rogers. Jim is an education and business consultant. He specialises in resilient leadership development, organisational culture and performance. He's a principal education advisor for Education Development Trust. He's a senior advisor for Independent Economics and we work together at that consultancy. He's director of his consultancy services and co-founder of the great Oracy Toolkit. In this episode, we chat about Dr. Jim's career, how we can use learning theory to help us prepare for exams more effectively, polyvagal theory and how this can help us with exam anxiety, or in fact any anxiety at all, resilience and well-being, and we also chat about our take on ethical leadership. This was a really informative episode. Understanding the science and theory behind learning, memory and anxiety is really fascinating stuff. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, Jim, and welcome to the Human 2 podcast.
Hi, nice to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. I'm excited to have this conversation. We do work together through Independent Economics in the organisational culture and performance practice. So I do know you a little bit, but I'm going to find out much more, I'm sure. So just to start off with, could you tell me a little bit about yourself and a brief kind of history of your career to our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, firstly, thanks for the invitation. It's quite exciting to be here. And normally I'm hosting things like this. Not that I've got this massive podcast or anything anywhere, but I did this through the pandemic when my role changed and I'm not used to being a guest. So if I get a bit intense, Hannah, just give me a look. Okay, so who am I? I'm Jim. I'm a father of two teenage girls. One has just started university. One is in the sixth form. I live in Cornwall, which I moved to in the early 90s and I keep coming back to. I like the countryside and I like the ocean and I like living down here next to the moorland. And my career is very varied, okay? So, and I could talk about this for hours, so I'm going to try not to, okay? But right now, what I do is I split my time between running my own business and education consultancy, which I'm sure I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. That's how I know you, through the Independent Economics as well. And I work with businesses and I work with school leaders. I do sort of leadership development work, coaching, organisational culture work, which is where our paths have crossed. I also run a couple of specific things around Oracy, so developing communication skills with young people for schools, particularly post-pandemic. That's become a real area of need. So we've got youngsters coming into the education system with a kind of a language deficit. And that's going to have a big impact on things like employability and the ability to earn and study as kids get older. So that's one very specific thing that I do through my consultancy. And I balance that time with working for a big international education charity called Education Development Trust, where I'm a principal education advisor. And I have written and I lead an executive leadership program for them that's funded by the Department for Education. It's a big 18-month part online and then part in-person accredited qualification for head teachers. So I kind of split my time between all of those things. It's a bit busy. And how have I got to this point? I started as a teacher in my late 20s. I had a bit of not a misspent 20s, but I was a bit of a lost soul in my 20s. I did lots of different things. I was a boat builder and I worked for a country park and in warehouses and things like that. And I travelled a lot.
Right.
But then I had a bit of a light bulb moment in a school for children with severe learning difficulties in London. And that led to me considering teaching as a career. And then I became a teacher. Half of my career was as a secondary teacher. And then I managed to convince Exeter University that they needed a geography teacher as one of their academics. It was a teaching and educational research fellowship. So I worked as a lecturer there and then did a master's and a PhD alongside it, alongside a massive pay cut. But that was a real big gamble that was worth taking. And then since then, I've been trying to use all of that learning in the work that I do. So I've had roles where I've coordinated school improvement across Plymouth and the Southwest, designing and delivering professional development programs for teachers, working for a large multi-academy trust, which is a group of 32, that was a group of 32 schools. And multi-academy trust is a group of schools. So I had a central role as a director for about 2,000 members of staff and kind of coordinating all of their professional development needs. And then 5 years ago, just over 5 years ago, just before the pandemic, big turning point in my life and my career was being made redundant. So I lost my job. I was living away from home at the time, so ended up coming back to Cornwall. I actually spent a summer, not a lot of people know this, I spent a summer working as a builder and a painter and a decorator, and I was putting fences up and I was servicing quad bikes and wondering what to do, and was approached by a group of schools to run one of these Oracy programs. So that I used that as an opportunity to set up my consultancy. And since then, I've been busy doing lots of different things. But I think that's it in a nutshell. That's been a very kind of how I've woven myself through life over the last few years.
Oh, it has been varied. Yeah, I didn't know a lot of that. And it's amazing how you can kind of find yourself in a career that you really enjoy, and it doesn't have to be linear and, staying in one company and climbing that ladder. And I think that'll be interesting to hear for a lot of trainees that are listening to this, because they might have just started in a large company and think, I will just stay here now and rise up to that point. I've also had a varied career, as you know, and moved around and tried different things. And I think it's the only way, really, to find out what you really enjoy.
Yeah, I think so, and I think a theme that I might come back to in this conversation is around the importance of taking risk and pushing yourself out of the comfort zone a little bit, taking on new challenges. I just think if you link that to, for example, well-being, which we'll talk about in a moment, I think it's really, really important to be on that kind of steep part of the learning curve. So that if you apply that to how you make decisions about your career, I think it's important to try different things, particularly when you're young as well, and you can get yourself out there and try stuff out and learn about yourself,
Definitely. Okay, so I mentioned accountancy trainees are a large part of our audience, but also just people working in the professional services industry, or who might be studying their accountancy exams, but they're not actually in their early careers. They might be a career changer, or they might be just studying later in life. In terms of studying, you've talked about learning theory and how that can help prepare us for exams more effectively. Can you expand on that and what you mean by learning theory?
Yeah, I will. This comes from listening to some of your other podcasts and also knowing your work. And working in education, this might sound a little bit surprising, but it's only been recently where the English education system has begun to use research evidence about how children learn to inform how we train teachers. So you'd think that would be the obvious place to start, but actually the evidence base around how the brain works and how we learn it's growing all the time, but it's been relatively poorly understood. And so what we've seen in education is a big movement towards using this research evidence to help us understand how we study, how we learn, and then being able to put that into practice in terms of professional development courses. And so when I listened to your one of your podcasts recently, I was thinking actually what we're doing could be really, really useful here for your listener base and how they prepare for exams. So I'm going to explain a few things, and I'm just going to give you very sort of top level. And some of this will sound really, really obvious, but it's worth just reminding ourselves of what works and what doesn't work. So learning is linked to memory, and we have very crudely, we have two types of memory. We've got short-term memory, which is like a processing memory. And then we have a long-term memory. And our long-term memory has got infinite capacity, which is amazing. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are. We have that infinite capacity to continue to learn throughout our lives. I think that sets us apart as a species, probably. So it's useful to know that we've got these two types of memory. When we're listening to something or when we're reading something, particularly when it's something new or we're listening to an instruction, we're processing that through our short-term memory. But our learning takes place when we start drawing from our long-term memory and connecting learning to prior learning. Okay, so making those connections. So one of the things that I would say in terms of like preparing for a test or an exam is the struggle to remember. So sitting down with a blank sheet of paper, or even going for a walk or going for a run, and again, we'll come back to why those things are important in a moment, and trying to remember stuff is probably the most important thing that you can do, because you begin to identify gaps, but also that struggle of recall of a concept or an idea or a piece of information is a really important part of that learning process and will help you with your revision. So that's the first thing. Second thing is about how we manage that short-term memory and something called cognitive load. None of us can multitask particularly well. So what we struggle to do is to manage different channels of information at the same time. It doesn't matter if you're a pilot, an astronaut, an accountant, teacher, whatever. We've got like a limited capacity to process information at any one time. And if we exceed that, then we reduce the space for learning. All right. So a really good example would be if I asked you to recite the alphabet and I timed you A to Z, you could do it in a matter of seconds. And if I asked you to count from 1 to 24, you could do exactly the same. But if I asked you to interleave the letter and the number, suddenly the task gets much harder and you start tripping up and it takes exponentially longer than the other two tasks. Or if I played an audio story and asked you to revise a topic and you were half listening to that story, you would struggle to find the capacity to make sense of the topic that you were kind of revising or learning from. And the reason I say all of this is it's very easy to sit down with your laptop or your notes and your phone and Instagram and Facebook and news channels and have the radio on in the background, and suddenly you're overloading yourself with information. So I know it sounds really obvious, but shutting yourself away from those things is really, really important. And then the other things I'd say, it's just real simple stuff. So revisit prior learning regularly, okay, even if it's not ready yet for your exam, going back through stuff regularly is a really effective way to kind of embed it in your long-term memory, doing that kind of recall bit, and to chunk tasks down in small sort of bite-sized amounts. Again, 20 minutes, have a quick break, 20 minutes, have a quick break. It's very easy to sit down and think, oh my God, I've got all of this stuff to do. You just got to break it all down. And the last thing I'd say, and this is an observation of mine really, is that as we get older, we carry more baggage. And part of that baggage is often self-limiting beliefs that we can't do something, or we're not very good at doing so. I'm not very good at exams, or I'm not very good at X, Y, and Z. And that's a learned behavior. And actually we can, if we approach it with the right attitude, we can do things, but you have to kind of put yourself out there to do that. So often when I'm working with adults, part of my job is to give them the confidence that they can do something when the task itself doesn't change. A lot of it is about how we approach something. And the very last thing is something that, depending on how old you are, a lot of us were taught that we had learning styles when we were at school. And a lot of people I talk to now, a lot of adults will say, yeah, I'm very practical. I'm a kinesthetic learner. I like using my hands, or I like listening to stuff and I like watching stuff. And really interestingly, there's no research at all to suggest that any of us have learning styles, particular learning styles. We all learn in the same way, but we do have preferences. So one of the challenges for a lecturer or a teacher is to try and mix things up so you keep people engaged all the time by using different tasks. But none of us have particular fixed learning styles that kind of impact our learning. It was made up by somebody probably in Cornwall in a shed once, and it seems to have stuck.
This is a disaster because I'm hosting a webinar soon with someone else, and part of it is on learning styles. So I'm going to have to go back to these slides now and just
Yeah,
adaptive.
I'll give you a hand. I'll give you a hand. But
Thank you.
yeah, you have to be a little bit careful. I gave that message once to an audience of soldiers.
Yeah.
And then at the end of this lecture to about 300 soldiers from all around the world, I was asked to go round the back of the lecture theatre to meet a group of them who had some questions.
Yeah.
And they're all in their fatigues. And I'm stood there with my little suit and my tie on, surrounded by these birdie blokes with their army fatigues, all saying to me, "What do you mean about learning style?" So I had to kind of try and explain what I was saying. So, yeah. But unfortunately, that is the case. That is the case.
What about neurodivergence? So I don't know if you know that I'm dyslexic, but I am. And therefore, the main thing that affects me when it comes to dyslexia isn't spelling, it's working memory. So when you were talking about the different kinds of memory, I was just wondering how that affects me and other people that might have issues with working memory. Because when I did a little bit of research on this when I was first diagnosed, because I didn't know what working memory was, um, it's not processing speed, it's different. And I wonder if it's part of that short term memory or long term memory. I'm not sure. But something's going wrong in terms of memory.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not an expert on this, but first of all, I challenge the wrong bit. It's just that we're all different, and actually, despite what I'm saying about learning styles, we're all different. Okay. So we all sit somewhere on some spectrum, and we have to remember that that is a human or a human construct. It's just a way of helping us understand how the brain works and how it works differently across different people. I think one of the things that I've noticed working with dyslexic students, and actually more recently working in business, is that quite often the most creative thinkers are actually people that are dyslexic. So they've had to learn tricks and ways around kind of orthodox communication, unorthodox so-called ways of learning, right? So I see it as a bit of a superpower, if I'm honest with you. I always envy working with people that just seem to be able to grasp quite an abstract concept, or can think things laterally in a way that perhaps education hasn't helped a lot of people to do, in the past. The piece about sort of processing memory, I suppose, again, we've all got to find a way of working, regardless of what I said about learning styles. If listening to something works for you and you can find a way of processing that information, that just means that like the channel that you're working through is the one that you can kind of make the most sense of. Okay. It's not a different learning style, but it's just a form of kind of communication that works with you. If you imagine cognitive load as like a cup, like your coffee cup, okay, and you fill that coffee cup up with, and this is cognitive load, so you fill it up with an instruction, and then you fill it up with the information for a task. And then the gap that's left is the amount of space that you've got to process that information. So the more complex the instruction, the more space it takes up in the cup. The more complex the information that you're providing alongside the instruction, the more space it takes up. And then very quickly we find we've got no space left to kind of make sense of it, to kind of process it. And what might be happening for you is that the communication of the instruction or the processing of the information is taking up too much cognitive load, and it's not giving you the space to kind of process it. So you've got to find ways of breaking those instructions down so you can kind of have enough space to process it.
Interesting. Very interesting. Another thing that just popped into my mind when you're talking about memory is people with dementia, because my grandma had dementia and her long term memory was incredible. That never went away. So she could talk about things that happened in her childhood and throughout her life and throughout her career. But it was just that short term memory that was gone. And I think
Yeah.
that's fascinating.
Yeah. Again, it's not something I'm an expert on, but what I'm really interested in is how we use our senses and our emotions to connect to place and experiences. So I'll give you an example. If you walk down the street and you get a waft of a smell from a restaurant or a flower shop or something, and it would take you to a different place. It might take you to that aeroplane that you've stepped off of onto the runway, and all the smells are different in that particular country. Or you might listen to a piece of music and it reminds you of splitting up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, and it takes you back to an emotional place. So the way we connect with the world is really, really interesting, I think, in terms of our sensory input and our emotional connection to the world around us.
So moving on to exam anxiety. So this is a topic that's come up many times during the podcast. It's something that I felt, particularly when I was resitting exams. And, if you're working at one of the top firms and you're resitting an exam, potentially you can lose your job if you don't pass that exam.
Yeah.
And I have lots of people coming to me now who are in a similar situation. So what can you tell me about polyvagal theory and how this can help with that kind of fear and anxiety?
Okay, so we're talking about, again, another kind of social construct, the polyvagal theory. So I'm going to explain a little bit about this polyvagal theory in a second. But the first thing I want to say is, and it won't feel like it at the time, but anxiety is normal. All right. So feeling anxious isn't necessarily a negative thing. But if we understand that anxiety is a normal kind of emotional feeling, if I explain to you a little bit about what anxiety is, my understanding of it, and how it links to us as an animal, as a species, I'll then explain the polyvagal theory. So as a species, we've been on this planet for about 300,000 years, a long, long time. And it's only been the last 11 or 12,000 years where we've begun to stop hunting and gathering, and we've begun to settle, and we've begun to farm, and we've begun to trade. And actually, there are different parts of the world where we are still hunter-gatherers. But physiologically, as a species, we've had a long period of that evolution where our survival skills have kept us alive. And anxiety is one of our survival skills. It's one of the things that we use to keep us alive. So we're hardwired. By that, I mean our autonomous nervous system is hardwired to keep us alive on a day-to-day basis. And we're constantly scanning for threats. We're constantly scanning for something that might cause us some harm. And then we have this physiological response to that perceived threat. And part of that is to feel anxious. And I'll explain why in a second. So first of all, and I'll come back to this again probably later when we talk about well-being, but like we're designed to be running around like the countryside catching things in small groups. It's only been very recently where we've had to sit down and do accountancy exams. Okay, so that's not really what
I think some people listening to this will be like, oh, I wish we were still in the hunter-gatherer stage of things.
Yeah, we used to see what I get up till the weekends. But yeah, anyway, so first of all, anxiety is part of our response to threats. And really interestingly, this is something I discovered recently, that one of our biggest perceived threats is social rejection. And if we feel rejected from a group of people, the reason why it can have such a big impact on us is because it used to be life-threatening. So if you were rejected from your group and you were out on your own, running around catching things, you were less likely to survive. So we're very, very conscious of how we're perceived by people around us. Right, so let's move on. We've got this nervous system that runs through our body, that connected to the brain, that keeps our heart pulsing, helps us breathe, helps us regulate our temperature, helps us digest, can affect our moods and our emotions. And that's your autonomous nervous system. We don't consciously do any of that. I'm not telling my heart to beat all the time. It's just doing it in the background. Within this, we've got this nerve called the vagal nerve. So it travels to all of your organs and back to a certain part of your brain, the medullus oblongata. That's where we process those sensory inputs. Now, the vagal nerve, this is another boring fact, but I absolutely love it. So vagal comes from the word to wander. And if you think of the word vagrant or vagabond, vagabond's my favourite word. So if you're a vagabond or a vagrant, you're wandering. This is your wandering nerve, and it wanders through your body, connecting all of your organs to your brain. So what happens is you perceive threat, that message goes through your autonomous nervous system, and it might raise your blood pressure, might cause you shortness of breath, it will pump a bit of adrenaline around your body, it will make you feel sick because your diverting energy away from your stomach. You get the butterflies, you might get the sweats. What's that doing? That is saying there's a saber-toothed tiger about to eat me, or I'm about to go into a job interview, or I'm about to do my accountancy test. Whatever we've decided is threatening, we're preparing our body against it. Okay. And that polyvagal theory, if you look it up, it's like a bell curve. And what's really interesting, and I've learned about this through working with young people through the pandemic, where we realized that trauma wasn't necessarily one isolated kind of instant. Trauma can be low level. So any long periods of uncertainty can have a traumatic effect on young, or on anybody, but on young people. And so we perceive that as a threat, and we feel less safe. So if you look on the graph that goes towards the peak of the bell curve, and our physiological response gets ramped up, we go through that fight and flight stages to ultimately to freeze, like we can't do anything, we're frozen with fear and panic. But what's really interesting is we can de-escalate it. And the really good thing is how we de-escalate it. So I listened to one of your guests talking about breathing exercises the other day, and it's absolutely spot on. So if I explain some of the thinking behind it, if you think that all of those autonomous actions that your body's doing, particularly breathing and your heart rate, they're rhythmical. And what appears to happen is if you do anything that's rhythmical, like going for a walk, a swim, a run, listening to music and breathing, like simple ones, it can de-escalate that anxiety very quickly. So it's the rhythm that seems to be linked to our kind of autonomous nervous system. We can de-escalate that sense of threat and bring us back into that safe space. And when we're in that safe space, we can socially connect, we can learn, we can process information. We've got past the panic phase. So the polyvagal theory helps us understand what we need to do to de-escalate that sense of risk. So if you're going into a job interview or you're doing some public speaking, so remember that social rejection is one of our ultimate fears.
Yeah.
You can understand now if you're going to go and do a speaking event or you're going to go into a room and get interviewed, you've got suddenly that, you've got to manage that social rejection in your mind by doing those really simple things, going through for a walk, the breathing in a paper bag, that kind of activity to help somebody through a panic attack. The paper bag has nothing to do with it really, other than to remind somebody that they need to breathe. And it's about using that rhythm to de-escalate the situation. So it's worth, if you're interested, it's worth looking at the polyvagal theory. It is a theory. It's just, again, a social construct, but it might help people understand, one, that anxiety is normal, and two, that it can be managed yourself quite effectively to bring you back into a space where you can function properly.
Yeah, so interesting. I just can't believe that kind of your thoughts just affect so much of your body. Do you know what I mean? Because it is just you thinking something's a threat then puts your whole body into that kind of fight or flight mode. And if you can change your thinking, it can just change how you react to stuff so much, can't it?
Yeah, it can. It's become very popular in sports science and sports psychology. So there's a guy called Professor Steve Peters. Some of your listeners will have heard of the chimp paradox. So it's the framework through which he's worked with people like Chris Hoy and the British cycling team and so on to help them understand how they prepare for high pressure competition. So he talks about the part of our brain that is there that's kind of primeval animal brain or lizard brain, and our logical rational mind. And it's the rational mind that can talk to the animal part of our brain or the chimp part of our brain and keep control of it. Young kids, when they have their tantrums, they're letting the animal part of their brain take control. They haven't learned the skills yet to kind of control it and rationalize fear. They just see fear, or they just see something that triggers them. So one of the things that we can do is use our brain and our rational thought and breathing and rhythm to kind of keep things back into context. It's really, really powerful.
And what you said about, people in education who have gone through the pandemic and they had that kind of low level trauma for a year or more, and all of their studies were disrupted. And it was the same for people that were sitting accountancy exams, but people in schools, people at university. So that's trauma. That counts as trauma.
It counts as trauma. And we're seeing a big knock-on effect in education now. So if you imagine babies born in the pandemic are now entering early years settings in nursery schools. And then you've got that knock-on all the way through. So you've got children, my eldest who's just started university, she was going through her GCSEs and that run up to her exams during and just after the pandemic. So I think that a lot of young people have lost out on some social connectivity. They've lost out on things like trips, things that we would normally do. And I think it doesn't matter what age. I think it affected everybody during that period. But for young people, that's quite a knock-on effect. I think that's got a big implication for employers, actually, and how they understand the needs of their employees, especially the younger ones coming into their settings.
Yeah. And you know what? I do hear sort of negative things sometimes about Gen Z, and I think Gen Z are brilliant, and they're probably going to change the way we work drastically, like no other generation has done before. And I don't think it's a bad thing. Right, moving swiftly on, resilience and well-being. So this is something I'm really passionate about. It's one of the reasons I started up Accountancy Hub. I can be pretty self-critical of myself and, hard working, which I think is to kind of make up for the dyslexia, especially when I didn't know I was dyslexic. So I was putting all of these things in place to help me, not knowing that I was kind of compensating. I have got better, especially through, learning about dyslexia and how it manifests for me and my strengths versus my weaknesses. But how can a person develop good habits for resilience and well-being?
I think this is a brilliant question. And I think if I link it back to what we've done so far, I think understanding, first of all, what the terms mean and how they kind of play out for you is really important as a starting point. So, first of all, I would suggest that resilience, we quite often see resilience as being like this tough structure, maybe the armor that we have around us to deal with kind of day-to-day stresses. If you were to picture an object that's resilient, you might pick a brick wall or a mountain or something, And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that resilience isn't about being tough. It's about being able to kind of morph yourself around different situations. You have to be a bit of a shapeshifter sometimes. And my preferred metaphor, I think, is actually something like a tree, So a tree bends in the wind, it grows, it drops its leaves, it's constantly changing and evolving in its environment, but it's still there. It has that kind of core strength. So for me, resilience isn't about being tough. It's about being able to understand that we're constantly moving through life, and sometimes things are working out, sometimes things aren't, but we can kind of adapt and evolve in those situations. I think if we're prepared to change, our capacity to be resilient increases. Then alongside this is that bit about armoring. I've worked with some incredible people over the last few years, and one person that's made probably the biggest impact on me is a guy called Stevie Ward, and I know I've mentioned him to you before. So he was Leeds Rhinos, I think, youngest captain, and Leeds Rhinos is a very successful rugby league team. And one of the things that he talked about was the pressure placed on him to be a certain way as a young player. He had to play like somebody else. He had to act like somebody else. When he was a captain, he had to be a captain like somebody else. And the pressure placed on him to be the person that he thought other people thought he should be. And you develop, I think, layers of armor around you when you do that, and you're not authentic as an individual. And one of the most powerful things that anybody can have is authenticity. It's the confidence to be yourself, to be who you are, not who you think other people think you should be. So alongside resilience, for me, comes authenticity. And we're going to link this back to leadership a bit later in the conversation. I think if we're constantly trying to be somebody else, that capacity to be resilient and tough soon disappears. So that's the first bit. Second bit, use a really interesting word, habits, right? So I would suggest that what we've just talked about and well-being takes a little bit of discipline, a little bit of effort. Anything that you do new to start with takes a little bit of effort. And then once you've done it enough, it becomes a habit. So for me, well-being is about being honest to myself, being authentic, and then also having good habits in terms of how I try and live my day-to-day life. So you won't be surprised to know that I think nature and being outside is really important. It might be why I live in Cornwall, but I think this is really important for everybody. Really interesting evidence base that sits behind this, the importance of being outdoors. Even things like the patterns of leaves against the sky have been seen to help calm us. And if you imagine a forest is probably a safer place to be when we're roaming the countryside, in our sort of prehistoric past, you can see why these environments have a positive impact on us in a kind of a well-being sense. So being outside, exercising, walking, moving, doing the things that we talked about earlier, rhythmical things to help keep us in a state of calm. All of those things I think are really, really helpful in terms of a well-being perspective. Not living for holidays. So not thinking, right, I've got 3 months and then I'm on holiday, because we've just shared stories of getting ill at Christmas. That's what happens. Like, you prime yourself for work and then you fall apart when you stop. So having those mini breaks every day, staying very grounded every day. And I think one of the last points I'll make on this is the pressure to perform from external sources. So we talked about trying to be somebody that you think other people think you should be. It's also, I think, like social media. Again, I don't want to sound like some old what's it here, but I think this kind of quest to be happy and to have shiny things can be quite detrimental in terms of how we perceive ourselves, that we're not good enough, we're not living in a way that we want to live, we're not happy. Everybody wants to be happy, but actually I think contentment is more important than happiness, and trying to draw a line a little bit on some of those external influences on what we think we should be, I think is really, really important. I could talk about this for hours, but if I do, I'll have a detrimental impact on people's well-being.
No, it's such an interesting topic. And yeah, I mean, social media, it is fake. I've got into social media a lot more since starting Accountancy Hub, and I went on TikTok for the first time and started posting a lot, especially on Instagram, and making more of an effort on LinkedIn than I ever have before. You can get addicted to it. You can also just, as you say, you can see things that just aren't real and are too aspirational and probably don't reflect someone's real circumstances anyway. You're just seeing a tiny little bit of their day or month in a snapshot. Social media, yeah. I mean, I've seen in the news that schools, I think they might have already rolled this out in some schools, I'm not sure, but taking mobile phones off students at the start of the day and giving them back at the end. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So there's two schools of thought here. One is that a mobile phone is a tool or an instrument for learning. We're always looking stuff up. We're in that world now where we've got instant access to information. And then you've got the school of thought that it's a distraction. Again, without going into the complexities of education at the minute, but we are seeing quite a negative impact on behaviour in schools post-pandemic as well, as some of the kind of structures of society and family life have been eroded. And you've got the increasing pressure of things like the cost of living at the minute. We've got problems in some schools with behaviour in a way that probably we didn't have to deal with before 4 or 5 years ago. And the phone is a part of that, So I think if it's dealt with in a mature way and it's consistently applied within a school setting and there isn't pressure on people to be one or the other, I think you've got to let schools make those informed choices. My own view is that if we're taking away a tool that we use every day as adults, I'm not sure how fair that is, but you have to manage that equitably in the school. And just as an aside, I was thinking about this just now, I do a lot of work in Denmark. And in Denmark, when I'm out there, nobody really talks about the impact of the pandemic, not in the way that we do in this country. And I think there's an interesting difference in the way that some of the countries responded to the same period and the same sense of threat. They spend a lot of time outdoors. They're happy to take the kids outdoors. They do a lot of outdoor learning. A lot of those Nordic countries behave in the same way in terms of kind of outdoor play. And I think that had a positive impact on managing some of the negative things that we've talked about through the pandemic. So it just goes to show that, that there are different ways of doing things.
I'm hearing so many good things about the Nordic countries. One of my best friends from school has moved to Copenhagen and she's absolutely loving it. And they get some kind of tax break for the first year that they're there or something. And then just the welfare system is so good. And if you're going to be a mum, like childcare is really good over there. Maybe I'll just move to Denmark.
Oh, if I had my time again, Hannah, I'd be there. I think so. I do a lot of work in Denmark, but I've also go out to Sweden and Norway. They're different cultures. Norway's particularly wealthy because of oil, but those countries tax really heavily as well. So you're paying a lot of tax, but the flip side is you get that additional welfare and support, particularly for young families. And I think there's a collective kind of response to our kind of day-to-day civil responsibilities in a way that we don't see necessarily in this country. Really interesting approach to work. They work hard, but they're happy to stop at 5 o'clock and go and have a beer or go for a walk, go for a swim. There isn't that pressure to work in the evenings and weekends and things like that. So I'm not saying that's universal, but that's what I see when I'm out there.
Yeah. Right, everyone, pack your bags. We're all moving to Norway, Denmark and Sweden.
Grass is green.
Right, applying for jobs. So we mentioned that we do work together in an organisational culture practice. We both are really passionate about workplace culture and ethical culture as well. So people that might be applying for either their first job or they're coming to the end of their accountancy studies and they're thinking, what do I do now? I want to leave my firm or I want to move into this area. What should they look for if they want to ensure they've got the right cultural fit for them?
I think this is a fascinating question. One of the first things I would say, and probably one of the things that you think about least when you're younger and perhaps kind of aspirational in terms of your career, is think about your own values. So what's important to you and why it's important. I think if you could do that earlier in your career, it's much easier then to kind of use that as a lens through which to make decisions about jobs, places to work, even countries to work. Okay, so first of all, who are you? Who are you? What works for you? What's important to you? Obviously, when you look at if you're looking at a company or an organization to work for from the outside, most of them now have nice shiny websites and they do all of that bit really, really well. So one of your jobs, I think, is to do your homework and to find out as much as you can about an organization as possible, whether that's through news channels, whether that's through talking to employees. I'd say that's probably the most useful. Going and having a visit, going having a walk around a place, just get a sense and a feel for an organization. The stuff that I'm interested in are things like how much agency you have as an employee, whether your voice is heard, whether there's a culture of kind of sharing ideas, problem solving, that kind of lateral thinking. And within that, whether there's diversity of voice. So for me, a diverse organization and diverse leadership teams are really, really powerful. And I know you and I have kind of shared some work on this before. I think that's something that I'll be looking for, particularly in a leadership team. I'm interested in, if I'm looking at the kind of the red flags for an organization, if there's high staff turnover, if people there are not there long, if there's not really an opportunity to give your opinion or there's no way of collecting sort of staff perspectives on things, that to me, that's an issue. And alongside this is like, how do I develop my career in your organization? So what support do you give me? Do you give me a mentor? Could I get a coach in the future? Do I get a chance to visit other organizations? Can I work on other projects? So what is there beyond just the job description that you're giving me that gives me an opportunity to further my career? We know a healthy culture is a culture where people are valued, where people want to work. There's a sense of belonging, connectedness. There's a kind of a pride in the family for that organization. they're the things that I would be looking for if I'm going to go and visit somewhere and decide if that's the place for me. There's one little extra dimension to this, and this is about online working, because this is, I think, again, it's relatively new for us, and to me there's dangers in terms of isolation. And if we're linking social connectivity to well-being, we didn't really talk about it just now, but I think connecting to teams is really important. And if we only work online, I think that's really, really hard to do. So if you're looking at a role that has an online working from home element, find out how many times you go into the head office, or whether you have team days, what they look like. Just get that sense of how you'll be nurtured and looked after as an employee, even if you're working from home. I think there's a real risk if we're just working from home all the time from a well-being perspective. So that's what I would say. What would you say, Hannah?
I completely agree with that last bit. I have to go to a co-working office a few times a week to make sure my well-being is maintained, because if I just work from home all the time, even if I'm having calls all day, it's not that level of connectivity that you really need. And it's nice to find out about people's personal lives a little bit, going to the office and say, how was your weekend? And, oh, have you moved into your new flat yet? Build those kind of informal relationships, which still is so hard to do when you're having a virtual call. You tend to just get to the point, why are you having that meeting? Go straight into it. But yeah, in terms of workplace culture, I just support everything you said, really. Inclusive culture, diversity in all its forms, ethical leadership. It's just sometimes hard to work out whether that's really there from a job interview. So like you said, walking around, speaking to people that work there, speaking to people that have left, speaking to other new joiners even, and what they might have heard. But it's tough. It's tough to find out when you haven't started yet whether it is going to be a cultural fit for you. All you can do is that research and that homework.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I wouldn't necessarily advocate this, but I remember hanging around in the car park of a school once, the day before my interview, to meet teachers coming out to their cars, because I had no other way. This is like it's a long time ago, pre sort of internet and stuff, just to say, what's it like working here? Yeah. And most people coming out saying, oh, I love it, it's great fun, nice people. That's what you want to hear the day before you go in on an interview. Also with a school, you're looking at the kids coming out, you're sort of walking around the community. It's a bit different for a business, but I think if you do your homework, the other thing I think here is about being brave about the decisions you make, which again, I might come back to in a minute, but if you feel that your values and your organization's values aren't aligned, you don't tough it out. That may be a sign that you need to move on. Obviously, have the conversation with colleagues, but it doesn't always fit, and sometimes you feel trapped in a place because you've got other pressures and responsibilities and mortgages and stuff. And do you know what? You just need to be brave and get going, because you never know what other opportunities will happen in the future if you make that decision.
Definitely. Okay, leadership. You are a bit of an expert when it comes to leadership, and I mean, my view is that you can be a leader at any level. You don't have to reach the C-suite to be a leader. And, even as a trainee, once you're a year there, you are then training the people that have just joined, and then you're a manager, pretty much. You're still very junior, but you're a manager and you are in a leadership position. So what advice would you give as a leadership expert for people who are in a leadership or managerial role? And I wanted to ask you what you think ethical leadership means as well.
Okay, so I don't think I'm an expert on anything. I love being a leader. Like, it's one of the most privileged roles and responsibilities. I love leading people, but it's taken me a long time to work out what kind of leader I am. And I've never had any sort of formal training on leadership. I went into a leadership role within a couple of years of starting my teaching career, made lots and lots of mistakes along the way, but I think it's really, really interesting. So the first thing I'd say is, again, if you're new into a leadership role, what are your values? Who are you? Who are you as a leader? How do you define yourself as a leader? What kind of leader do you want to be? Who's led you in the past that's had a positive impact on you as a person, and how have they done that? Probably not somebody that's barked orders at you. it probably is somebody that's kind of nurtured you and supported you and helped you grow and flourish as an individual. So I think this term ethical leadership is very broad, but if we didn't have ethical and moral codes in society, society would collapse. And one of the things that I get a little bit concerned about, both in business and in education and in the public sector, is where there's space for egos to drive somebody, you tend to find an erosion of moral and ethical behaviours around that. So to me, it's all about behaviours. It's how you live and breathe the kind of leader that you want to be. So when I work with leaders, one of the first things I do is get them to think about what their values are and who they are as a person, but then also what their most important resource is. And for almost everybody, doesn't matter what you make, doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter what you create, it's the people that are the most important resource. Even though, and this will time date this podcast, but today Keir Starmer's talked about UK being a powerhouse for artificial intelligence, the people are still the most important. They are your human resource. So if that's the case, how do you leverage all of that expertise and creativity and brilliance you have in your teams as a leader? That's your job as a leader. So for me, ethical leadership is around being people-centric and making sure that you're serving and looking after the people around you. There are obviously always times where you have to be decisive, where you have to give orders, where you have to hold people to account. But I think if you do that in a fair way, if you're transparent, if you can communicate decisions that you're making, you tend to bring people with you. I know you've seen me say this, but one of my favorite descriptions or definitions of leadership is by a guy called Shay. This is in Daniel Coyle's book, The Culture Code. He described his role as a very, very successful CEO of an organization as being the architect of the greenhouse. So he saw his job as creating the structure within which people would flourish. He wasn't the one watering the plants. He wasn't the one sowing the seeds. He was the one creating that environment for others to grow. And another thing he talks about is the importance of, I can't remember the exact term, but the importance of collisions within that space. So how you create opportunities for people to come together that wouldn't normally come together, to have conversations, to develop ideas and solutions. Interestingly, universities are beginning to do this now with their physical space to bring different teams together around some problems that would normally be dealt with kind of in separate departments. So that's, again, an example of bringing those people together. The very final thing that I say, and this is about organisational resilience and this is about leadership, I think we're beginning to see a really important space for organisations to think beyond perhaps a narrow view of success. A resilient organisation is an organisation, I think, that is beginning to understand that it needs to add value to, first of all, recognise and then add value to all stakeholders. So that's internal teams, it's external customers, that could be suppliers, that could be parents in a school. So understanding who those stakeholders are and then what you do to add value to them brings a depth to your organisation that you don't get if you're just chasing the headline performance figures. And the risk, I think, is if that's all we do, then ultimately when there's a big change, we haven't got the capacity to kind of deal or respond to that. Some really interesting work. A friend of mine called Matt Roberts has a podcast called Wider Goals. And he's been talking to sports leaders and business leaders about how they've gone about their jobs, thinking about the wider goals, the wider kind of perspective, who their stakeholders are. It's a kind of a framework around something called conscious capitalism. So if anybody's interested, have a look at the Wider Goals podcast. The first one with Jason Stockwood is amazing. And then if you're interested, read, there's a book about conscious capitalism. It's worth exploring.
I'll definitely check that out. I think that's so interesting what you said about looking at all those different stakeholders and how are you adding value, because I'm really interested in ethics and it's something that we're taught as part of the accountancy qualification. But then as accountants, we're working in financial institutions, often professional services, which are very revenue driven and how many clients can we get, and how can we get money out of these clients. And so I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes between all the ethical stuff we've learned, and we need to behave with integrity and objectivity, but then actually we've got these really strong financial goals that are the main goals, let's be honest. And there is a clash sometimes, for sure.
I think so. And I think, there's pressure often for short-term performance gains in any organisation. And we've got to be thinking, I think, longer term. So a real simple example would be the impact of the environment. So if we understand what our responsibility is as an organisation to the environment, but then we also understand how supply chains or how the economy, and I know the independent economics team do a lot of work on this. If we understand that each one of those groups has a vested interest in ensuring the environment is as good as it could be, then we're all more likely to behave in a way that has a positive impact on that environment. When I talk about environment, I'm talking about, literally the environment, that the one that we live in and the one that we see burning in California at the minute. So I think it's really, really important that we see our responsibilities as beyond just the immediate profit or the immediate performance of an organisation, to build that kind of resilience and sustainability into that kind of structure. And again, it comes down to leadership, and it comes down to understanding who your stakeholders are and how you add value to. You might add value that is a cost to you, that's initially, but further down the line will be an investment. But I think it's a fascinating area.
Yeah. I mean, it's in the news about Shein, isn't it, at the moment, that fast fashion brand, and how they've been using slave labour or massively underpaid labour. I mean, fast fashion is a bit of a environmental issue anyway, because it is literally quite low quality clothes, and do we need more low quality clothes in our lives? But it's affordable, it's very affordable for people, but then their supply chain is massively unethical.
Yeah. So, I mean, what one interesting thing to look at is something called the B Corp certification for businesses, and it looks at exactly what we've been talking about, the kind of wider responsibilities for an organisation. So socially, environmentally, economically. I'm not an expert on it, but there's other sort of measures that they'll look at. So if you took your typical, like Patagonia, for example, as a business, the way it's structured, the way it's led, the way Patagonia understands long-term thinking, understands environmental, social responsibilities, you're not going to get a piece of clothing that's been made in a sweat house in China coming through the business. The payoff is you're going to have to pay more for it. And I'm not an advocate for Patagonia, and I don't own anything, I don't think, made by Patagonia. But I know that if I did and it broke, they'd fix it for me as well. So suddenly there's kind of long-term thinking in that product in a way that I don't think that we've had. And I have a bit of a thing about Amazon. I use Amazon when I'm desperate, but I always feel guilty when I hit and I know the next day this screwdriver or, I don't know, notepad or something turns up at my door. How much energy is it taking to get it from wherever it was in that massive warehouse to my front door in a day? And we just expect it, So it's mad, isn't it?
It is mad. And it's just so convenient. But yeah, you're right. The amount of effort that has gone into that. Final question. I always ask this to people at the end of the podcast. What would you tell your younger self? So young Jim, maybe just before he started his first job, or he was just starting out in his first job, which was what, by the way?
My first job after university was in a boatyard.
Excellent. So you're just starting out in the
lived
boatyard.
in a tent and worked in a boatyard on a night shift.
Incredible. What would you tell young Jim?
It's a really good example, actually, because I was miserable. I've been thinking about this question because I did a lot of things in my 20s, lots of travel, lots of exploration, lots of adventure. But throughout most of it, I also felt this weight of expectation and pressure on my shoulders to get on with my career and to be somebody. What I know now, looking back, was that I wouldn't be sat here now if I hadn't had those experiences in my 20s, but I didn't know that at the time. So I found it really, really troubling. You know, I really struggle with some of the decisions that I was making. So if I was to go back and meet myself again, I'd say be brave and confident in the decisions that you're making. Don't try and be that person that you think people think you should be. Be yourself. That's what I'd say.
Absolutely love that. And there'll be so many people listening to this who feel that weight of expectation and who have gone down a certain route because it's what their parents wanted, or it's what their father did, or their mother did. And hello, Elsa. And it might not be for them, or they might be thinking, I'll just get through it and I'll do something else. And I mean, all of your 20s is just, it's a weird time for discovery. And it does tend to work out.
It always works out. Somebody said to me, so this was at the end of my 20s when I first started teaching. I had a tutor at university who took me under his wing a little bit because I was quite wayward. I was a bit of a anti-establishment rebel of my first assessments. And one of the things he said to me was always try and be on the steep part of the learning curve. You know, try and put yourself there where you're pushing yourself, which is the first thing that we talked about in this conversation. And I think that if you understand it, that it's okay to be there, and it's okay to be a bit anxious, and it's okay to be a bit stressed sometimes, and we can't be perfect, but taking risk is important and being brave about your decisions. I think you'll go well in life. You'll go well in life. So that would be my final thought.
Perfect. We'll end it there. Thank you so much, Jim. I've loved this podcast. I'm going to do some really good reflections at the end of this, picking out some highlights of our conversation. Thank you.
Brilliant. I loved it. Thank you very much.